stories. They capture us, entertain us, and define who we are. You can find them basically everywhere, and Subnautica is no exception. From the harrowing tales of the degasi to the various fates of your doomed shipmates, most of these stories have been extensively documented in the now 7 years since the game's full release. However, there remains one exception. A sole story that was swept under the rug so thoroughly, it managed to remain hidden from even the most dedicated players this whole time. That is, until now. Today, I'll be telling you the story of Subnautica's Forklift. Its creation, controversy, and of course, everything that happened on that terrible day. Our story begins around 50 years ago in a period known as the Expansion. As technology improved and space travel became easier, humans began to rapidly expand across the galaxy. However, with this newfound expansion came newfound conflict, eventually leading to a full-scale war between the most dominant factions. For most, this time was more than likely horrific and destructive, but in the midst of the chaos, others saw opportunity. One such group was the Altera Corporation. Altera was a small weapons manufacturer, and while they could have easily gotten sucked into the conflict like everyone else, they happened upon a different path. In a masterclass of social and political maneuvering, Altera managed to start selling weapons to all major sides in the conflict. This had the dual effect of weakening the competition and generating the company enormous profits, which they could use to expand their operations. However, as their presence increased, Altera ran into a problem. You see, all of the weapons produced by Altera had to be delivered to their respective buyers. That meant a cargo ship had to leave a factory, travel across interstellar space, offload at its destination, and return home. In the early days, Altera was small enough that these deliveries mostly flew under the radar. But as time went on, these cargo ships were increasingly targeted by hostile forces, either to prevent their enemies from getting supplies or to steal it for themselves. Not only was this costing Altera vast sums of money, but it risked pulling them into the conflict, which would certainly doom the small corporation. If Altera wanted any hope of maintaining their operations, they needed a way to safeguard their delivery ships. And that's when a man by the name of George Vandelay had an idea. George was a foreman on one of Altera's logistics teams and had personally oversaw dozens of shipping runs. He had quickly learned that ships moving through interstellar space were rarely attacked, due to the ship's high speed and a relative lack of deep space tracking infrastructure. However, once they arrived at their destinations, the ships would need to slowly unload their cargo over the course of several hours, giving hostile forces ample time to plan and launch an attack. George realized that if the ships could unload their cargo faster, then they might be able to take back off before their would-be attackers could do anything. But actually doing this wasn't going to be easy. Most of the cargo ships were extremely bare bones and didn't have the electrical capacity to support large equipment. The war-torn worlds they were delivering to weren't much better off, and thus, most cargo ended up having to be unloaded by hand, which was extremely slow. To solve this problem, George developed the Strategic Transport Vehicle Mk1, better known as the STV-1 or Forklift. It was simple to operate, small enough to stow away on almost any spacecraft, and best of all, the revolutionary power cell could run the forklift for 3 months on a single charge. For Altera, the forklift was nothing less than a game changer. Cargo could be unloaded faster, which meant ships were vulnerable for less time, causing attacks to drop drastically. Altera's business reached new heights, giving them unprecedented amounts of leverage and control. As for George, what happened next was better than he could have ever hoped. For the success of his creation, George was admitted onto Altera's board of directors, gaining a litany of personal perks alongside massive influence within the company. In other words, because of the forklift, George was set for the rest of his life. As profitable as the war had been for Altera, even they realized it couldn't go on forever. Leveraging its massive influence in weapons production, Altera threatened to cut off any side not willing to come to the table. Not long after, 37 governing bodies came together to sign the charter. a legal contract which established rules on the exploration, colonization, and governing of space. After years of fighting, the war was finally over. But for Altera, their work had seemingly just begun. With the weapons trade exploited for just about all it had been worth, Altera began working to consolidate their gains and pivot to new industries. To accomplish this first goal, Altera pursued a rapid plan of reconstruction. For those able to pay, Altera would bring life-saving supplies and equipment to help them recover. For those who weren't, Altera simply took over and did the same thing. The Forklift quickly became indispensable to these operations. Its extremely long battery life was crucial in places where power had yet to be restored, and once the afflicted worlds began to recover, STV-1s could be found on factory floors and in warehouses all across the galaxy. This did wonders for forklift production, rising from 200,000 units per year at the end of the war to 5 million in just 2 years. To accomplish Altera's second goal, the company formed what can be thought of as its modern organizational structure. For smaller companies, Altera would provide expensive services such as starship production and access to the emerging phasegate network. All a company had to do to receive these services was relinquish a certain portion of their profits, as well as giving Altera a partial stake in the company's ownership. One company that took this deal was a security apparatus headed by Jerry Ross. While major conflicts were a thing of the past, pirates and some smaller independent groups still necessitated some protection for high-profile sites. And for a fee, this was a need that Jerry and his team were happy to fill. So when Altera sent Jerry's team out to guard a facility on a remote moon, they didn't think much of it. They headed out to the moon, and while they didn't know exactly what they were guarding, they still did their best to remain vigilant. But as the days turned to weeks and the weeks turned to months, Jerry began to get a bit restless. Outside of their work, there really wasn't much else on the moon to do, and they were so far away from Federation space that information from the outside world was hard to come by. Jerry held out as long as he could, but just over 6 months in, he finally broke. He figured that he just needed a few days off-world to reconnect, and then he'd be good to go. There was just one problem. Given the importance of the mission, he knew there was no way Altera would approve such a leave. But Jerry had faith in his team and knew they could probably handle everything for a few days. Besides, they'd been guarding this facility for over half a year, and not once had they ever so much as seen anyone. So after talking it over with his team, Jerry snuck aboard an outboard resupply ship and headed towards a well-deserved break. But unbeknownst to Jerry and his team, they weren't as alone as they thought. For the past 2 weeks, they were being monitored by Marguerite Maida, a member of the Trans-System Federation. While her mission profile was strictly intel and reconnaissance, Marguerite wasn't exactly known for playing by the rules. Over the course of 3 days, Marguerite methodically eliminated the entire security force. Just 48 hours later, Jerry returned to the moon, only to find the facility had been raided and his entire crew was dead. In the following weeks, a Transgov court found Jerry at fault for sneaking off-world during the mission. He was quickly fired and would have faced jail time had it not been for Marguerite getting caught and receiving her own punishment. But with no job and credits quickly running out, Jerry was forced to return home. His chances of ever getting another security job were basically non-existent, but he was able to find work in a local warehouse. The hours were long and the pay was low, but it was just enough to keep him afloat. Maybe, after everything he'd been through, things would finally be able to go back to normal. The date is Tuesday, October 23rd. Jerry arrives at work and begins using a forklift to unload a new cargo shipment. An hour later, he brings the forklift to the charging bay and starts cataloging the new inventory. Back in the charging bay, the forklift's power reaches 100%. To prevent the power cell from being overcharged, the charging system is supposed to switch off at this point. But for some reason, perhaps a power surge, short circuit, or lack of maintenance, we don't know for sure, This doesn't happen. Now, this on its own shouldn't have been a problem. Electrical devices had for decades been designed with built-in failsafes to prevent overcharging, and the forklift was no exception. But in the rush to produce forklifts during the war, a few safety tests had been pushed aside and ultimately forgotten. Had these tests been run, they would have revealed a critical problem with the failsafe. A missing wire connecting the forklift's computer to the power shutoff switch meant the computer had no way to activate the failsafe. As the power cell continued to gain charge, it began to heat up, slowly expanding and pushing on the forklift's frame. Rivets within the frame began to pop, pinging off the walls like gunshots. Jerry rushed into the room to see what was going on, but it was too late. The power cell's casing ruptured, releasing 3 months' worth of energy in a massive explosion. Once the dust had settled, the extent of the damage became clear. The explosion leveled the warehouse and toppled 2 neighboring buildings. Over 1,000 people were injured, and 281, including Jerry, were left dead. Back at Altera HQ, it didn't take long for news of the disaster to reach George, and right now, this was the last thing he wanted to hear. He'd recently been retooling the forklift's design when he stumbled across the problem with the failsafe, and he wasn't so convinced that it didn't have anything to do with what happened. So he sent a small team of scientists to get the truth. It wasn't good. The explosion's profile almost perfectly matched a blown power cell, and the forklift's was the only one with enough power to do it. George knew that once this got out, he'd be in big trouble. Not only could he be held responsible, but Altera would have to recall what was now an estimated 200 million forklifts for repair. Such a feat would cost the company a fortune, and almost certainly end in George getting kicked out of the board of directors. But there was a slight glimmer of hope. The incident was currently being reported as a gas explosion. The world didn't know what had really happened, at least for now. Not willing to give up his lavish lifestyle, George began concocting a plan to hide the truth. Being on the board of directors had given him both power and a good reputation, and he was going to need to leverage all of it to make this thing work. George called foul play and managed to get the site designated as a crime scene, which would prevent any third parties from coming in and accidentally stumbling across the truth. This would work for the time being, but with the press soon realizing that there was, in fact, no gas lines leading to the warehouse, George and his team were going to have to come up with their own story. And that's exactly what they did. They claimed Jerry, in a damaged mental state following the death of his crew and subsequent firing, had gone on a rampage with a ballistic assault rifle before setting off a homemade explosive in a suicide attack. This story, while somewhat far-fetched, fit with bystanders' accounts of loud popping noises before the explosion, and since no one close to Jerry at the time of the incident was still alive, there really wasn't anyone who could claim otherwise. George presented this story to a TransGov court, who found little reason to doubt the high-standing board member. The case was subsequently closed, and George was off the hook. He paid off everyone involved and set about modifying the forklift's production line to fix the issue. Any forklifts brought in for maintenance were also quietly repaired, and thankfully there hasn't been a major incident since. And that's where the story would have ended, had it not been for Altera. You see, while George was busy trying to cover up the true cause of the explosion, everyone else on the board of directors was busy dealing with another issue. While Altera had made massive territorial gains following the expansion war, its ability to actually exert control over all these new worlds was still relatively limited. And a big reason why was the very same thing that had gotten them all these gains in the first place. After the war, all of the weapons and blueprints produced by Altera didn't just go away. Instead, they quickly spread throughout the galaxy. While the chaos and destruction of the expansion war had been great for Altera, if all of those guns were to ever be turned against them, they could very well undo every gain Altera had made. To prevent this, they needed a way to get those weapons back, but they couldn't just go in and take them without causing a ruckus. What Alterra needed was an excuse, something they could use to justify disarming their entire population. And it just so happened that George's fictitious story fit the bill. So while George was perfectly happy to just put the whole thing behind him, the rest of Alterra took the story and ran with it. The event was officially named the Massacre on Abraxas Prime, and Alterra used it to justify a near-complete ban of weapons within their territory. Blueprints were removed from fabricators, and existing stockpiles were either bought back or confiscated in the following months. This spearheaded a wave of other changes as Alterra worked to cement their control. Computers began monitoring employee conversations and keeping recordings whenever suspicious keywords were detected. Successful corporations could now be forcibly bought out by Alterra, and employees were now kept on the clock after even the most catastrophic of incidents. And for now, this is where the story of the Forklift actually ends. Whether we'll get more details in Subnautica 2 isn't currently known, but even if we don't, it's safe to say that the Forklift is one of, if not the most impactful vehicle in the Subnautica universe. Hey, thanks for making it to the end. If you haven't already, consider subscribing. I've got a couple of videos I'm really excited to start working on, and I wouldn't want you to miss them. Anyways, that's all for me for now. I hope to see you all again very soon.